Emergency alert. Do not touch the wallpaper.
This is an emergency alert. If you are inside an old house and you hear whispers behind the walls, do not touch the wallpaper. The patterns move when you're not looking. They remember every voice, every scream, every death. I was sent to restore the mansion's walls. But the house, it remembered me. Now the whispers won't stop, and something is trying to get out. The
air inside the mansion was thick with dust and the faint, musty scent of decay. Sunlight, pale and reluctant, filtered through grimy windows, casting long, angular shadows across the floorboards strewn with debris. Mark Benson shifted his weight uneasily, watching Evelyn as she moved with restless energy, her eyes darting toward the peeling wallpaper again and again, as though expecting it to reveal new secrets at any moment. "Evelyn," Mark said finally, his voice low and edged with something between concern and frustration. "You need to slow down. You're running yourself ragged. And for what? The wallpaper's just paper." Evelyn paused, a strip of faded floral pattern crumbling in her gloved hand. Her breath caught, a whisper of air that might have been a sigh or a shiver. "It's not just paper," she said quietly, eyes fixed on the shifting shapes beneath the surface. "There's something here. Something the house wants me to see." Mark rubbed the back of his neck, his rough hand trembling ever so slightly. "Look, I get it. This place has history, and you want to uncover it. But you're pushing yourself too hard. You haven't eaten properly in days, and you barely sleep. You're not thinking straight." Evelyn's gaze lifted to his face, the lines of worry etched deep. "I'm fine," she insisted, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her. "I just need more time." "More time won't help if you burn out," Mark said, stepping closer, voice dropping to a firm but gentle tone. "You've got to take care of yourself, Evelyn. This obsession, it's dangerous." She looked away, swallowing hard as the mansion settled around them with a slow, creaking groan. The walls seemed to breathe, the wallpaper's faded motifs, twisting and folding like living things just at the edge of vision. The whispers, faint but persistent, tugged at her mind, pulling her deeper into the house's secrets. "I can't stop now," Evelyn whispered, almost to herself. "Not when I'm this close." Mark frowned, glancing around the dim room. Close to what? Before she could answer, a sudden creak echoed from the far end of the hall, the sound sharp and accusing. Both turned toward the noise, the mansion's silence broken like fragile glass. Evelyn's heart pounded as shadows shifted unnaturally across the peeling wallpaper, forming shapes that vanished the moment she blinked. "It's this place," she said, voice trembling. "It's alive." Mark shook his head slowly. "Or maybe it's just an old house settling." "You have to ground yourself in reality, Evelyn." She nodded faintly, but the tension in her chest tightened. Mark's words were a lifeline, yet they also underscored the vast gulf between their worlds. His practical skepticism and her gradual descent into obsession with the mansion's hidden past. As the afternoon light waned, Mark moved toward the staircase, his footsteps heavy. "Come on," he urged. "Let's take a break. You need to eat, rest. We can't have you falling apart here." Evelyn hesitated, torn between the pull of the wallpaper's secrets and the very human concern in Mark's voice. Finally, she allowed herself to be led away from the decaying walls, the whispers retreating, but never fully silenced. Outside, the cold air was sharp and biting, a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere within. Evelyn leaned against the cracked porch railing, eyes on the crumbling facade of the mansion. The house might be rotting, but it still held its stories tight, and she was determined to unravel every one, even if it meant losing herself in the process. "You're not alone," Mark said quietly, standing beside her. "But you've got to promise me you won't let this place swallow you whole." Evelyn met his gaze, a flicker of vulnerability breaking through her stubborn resolve. "I promise," she said, though deep down, She wasn't sure if she meant it. As twilight descended, the mansion loomed behind them, its shifting walls and whispering wallpaper waiting silently for the next day, the next revelation, the next step deeper into its heart of darkness. And Evelyn knew, with a growing certainty, that the line between restoration and ruin was thinner than she had ever imagined. The afternoon light waned as Evelyn's fingers traced the peculiar edges of the wallpaper in the mansion's east parlor. For days now, she had been consumed by the subtle irregularities in the walls, the shifting patterns, the unsettling whispers, but today, a sharper detail caught her eye. A faint outline of a panel, its edges almost imperceptible beneath the peeling floral paper. Her breath caught. This was no ordinary flaw. She knelt, brushing away years of dust and grime, and pressed gently against the wall. The panel gave way with a reluctant creak, revealing a narrow gap breathing stale, musty air into the dim room. Heart-pounding, Evelyn fetched her flashlight and wedged the panel wider open. The hollow space behind was cold, smelling of damp wood and forgotten secrets. She slipped through, her boots crunching softly on shattered plaster and brittle floorboards. Before her stretched a cramped chamber, walled in by raw studs and shadowed corners. Moonlight filtered through a cracked window, dust motes dancing in the faint glow, illuminating a jumble of relics, tattered letters bound by faded ribbons, a cracked porcelain doll lying face down, and a tarnished silver locket engraved with the initials M.B. Her fingers trembled as she picked up the letters, their paper brittle, edges curled with age. Carefully, she untied the ribbon, revealing scrawled script in faded ink. The words were fragmented, but unmistakably filled with anguish and fear. They spoke of secrecy, betrayal, and a desperate hope for justice. Evelyn's pulse quickened. These were Margaret Blackwood's letters, her voice reaching across time from the shadowed depths of the mansion. At the back of the room, half buried beneath debris, Evelyn found a leather-bound journal, its clasp rusted and weak. She opened it gingerly, the pages brittle but legible. The journal chronicled Margaret's final days, her mounting dread of unseen threats, whispered arguments in the dead of night, and a chilling premonition that her life was in imminent danger. As Evelyn read, a shiver ran down her spine. The mansion's whispers seemed to swell, wrapping around her like a cold breath. Behind her, the wallpaper shifted. The floral patterns rippled as if stirred by a phantom breeze, and then, faintly, the sorrowful visage of a woman appeared, ethereal, pale, with eyes full of despair. It was Margaret, her silent plea etched into the very fabric of the house. Evelyn turned, heart pounding, but the image dissolved as quickly as it had formed. She sank to the floor, clutching the journal. The room felt alive, charged with the weight of decades-long secrets finally unveiled. The evidence was irrefutable now. The murder was no mere rumor whispered by the walls. It was real, brutal, and hidden behind layers of decay and denial. Evelyn's resolve hardened. She was no longer just restoring a house. She was unraveling a legacy of pain and silence. Yet, as the shadows deepened around her, doubt crept in. Was the mansion reaching out to her, or was her mind fracturing under the strain? The line between past and present blurred, and Evelyn felt the walls close in tighter, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. The hidden room was a tomb of secrets, but also a crucible that would test her sanity and courage to their limits. She rose, clutching the evidence close, and looked back at the peeling wallpaper, now seeming less like decoration and more like a living witness to Margaret's tragedy. The mansion was speaking, and Evelyn was listening whether she wanted to or not. Outside, the wind howled through the skeletal trees, carrying the murmurs of a story long buried but never truly silenced. The late afternoon light slanted through the grimy windows of the Victorian mansion, casting long shadows over the peeling wallpaper and scattered tools. Evelyn Harper wiped the sweat from her brow, her fingers tracing the faded floral patterns that had begun to reveal more than just decay. They whispered stories, secrets, and sorrow. Just as she set down her brush, the sound of the heavy wooden door creaking open broke the stillness. Detective Harper entered, his presence commanding yet measured. The sharpness in his eyes belied the softness in his voice when he finally spoke. "Ms. Harper. I'm Detective Harper. We've reopened the Blackwood case." Evelyn's heart tightened not just at the name, but at the unexpected familiarity. The detective's gaze lingered on her, a flicker of something unspoken passing between them. "I wasn't expecting anyone," she admitted, brushing dust from her worn jacket. He approached the battered table, spreading out yellowed files and photographs, their edges curled with age. "The case was cold for decades, but your work has stirred new interest. The authorities want to understand what you've uncovered." Evelyn felt a swell of conflicting emotions, relief that the truth might finally surface, and fear that the official investigation would shatter the fragile connection she felt to the mansion and its restless spirit. "I've been hearing things," she confessed, voices, whispers in the wallpaper. "I don't know if it's the house or me." Detective Harper's eyes softened momentarily. "Sometimes the past demands to be heard, whether we were ready or not." Their conversation was interrupted by a sudden draft, the windows rattling as the wind swept through the broken panes. Evelyn shivered, the weight of the mansion pressing down upon her. "You and I," the detective began carefully, "we have more in common than just a name. My grandmother was part of the Blackwood household staff. I grew up hearing stories, some true, some whispered in fear." Evelyn's breath caught. The personal stakes had just deepened. This was no longer just a restoration, it was a reckoning. The detective detailed the reopened investigation's scope, the renewed interviews with locals, and the forensic examinations planned for the hidden room she had discovered. As he spoke, Evelyn's mind raced through memories, whispers, and half-glimpsed images. Could the answers lie not just in the mansion's walls, but in the tangled histories of those who had come before? Night fell, and with it, the mansion seemed to grow colder, its shadows deeper. Evelyn found herself drawn to the wallpaper once more, the shifting patterns now seeming to pulse with a life of their own. Detective Harper's presence was both a comfort and a challenge, his logical approach grounding her, while the personal connection stirred long-buried feelings of loss and determination. As the detective prepared to leave for the evening, he paused at the door. "Be careful, Evelyn. The past has claws." She watched him disappear into the dusk, the mansion settling back into silence, save for the faintest of whispers carried on the cold air. The investigation was no longer a distant possibility, it was here, and with it, the promise of truth and the threat of revelation. Evelyn sat down at the table, the files before her illuminated by the flickering candlelight. The mansion had spoken again, and this time the voices would not be ignored. Outside, the wind howled through the skeletal trees, the house breathing in the secrets of a past that refused to die. Inside, Evelyn's resolve hardened. She would face whatever shadows lurked beneath the wallpaper, no matter the cost. The afternoon light filtered weakly through the sullen clouds, casting a pale glow over the peeling wallpaper and crumbling plaster of the mansion's study. Simon Clark had taken charge of the room, his cautious hands spreading out a collection of brittle documents, photographs, and yellowed letters across the dust-encrusted oak table. The single lamp on the desk flickered slightly, its wavering light dancing over the faded ink and sepia-toned images, as if the house itself was reluctant to reveal its hidden truths. Evelyn stood close by, her eyes flicking anxiously between the papers and Simon's face. The weight of the mansion's silence pressed down on her, mingling with the growing storm inside her mind. She had come to expect the walls to whisper, the wallpaper to shift, but this was something far more tangible and terrifying. "Look at this," Simon said, adjusting his glasses as he tapped a brittle letter. The handwriting was elegant yet hurried, the words almost smudged beyond recognition, but enough remained to send a chill through Evelyn's veins. This letter was written by one of the Blackwood family members shortly after Margaret's death. It's clear from the tone that they feared what might come to light if the truth was told. Evelyn's fingers hovered over the fragile paper, her breath catching. They tried to hide it. Simon nodded, his brow furrowed with frustration. More than hide it. They actively suppressed the investigation. Paid off officials, silenced witnesses. Margaret's murder was buried beneath layers of lies and deceit. A heavy silence settled between them, broken only by the soft creak of the house settling and the faint sound of wind rattling the broken window panes. Evelyn's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of whispered voices, shifting wallpaper images, and now this tangible evidence of betrayal. The mansion's decay, she murmured, her voice barely audible. It's like the physical manifestation of their corruption rotting away but refusing to be erased. Simon looked up sharply, meeting her gaze. You were right. The house remembers what the family tried to forget. And so do you. Evelyn felt a sudden surge of anger and despair. Why did they do it? Why bury her story? Simon sighed, running a hand through his disheveled hair. Power, reputation, greed. The Blackwoods had everything to lose. Margaret was a threat not just to their image, but to the fortunes and secrets they guarded jealously. Their conversation drifted into a tense debate. Evelyn's obsession with the supernatural clashed with Simon's insistence on historical facts. She accused him of dismissing the house's whispers, while he cautioned her against losing herself to the shadows creeping in at the edges of her perception. You can't let this consume you, Simon warned, his voice low but firm. We need the truth, yes, but we need to keep our feet on the ground. Evelyn's eyes flashed with defiance. And if the ground itself is poisoned, if the truth is tangled in the very walls. The argument ended unresolved, leaving a crack widening between their once tentative alliance. Yet beneath the tension lay a shared determination. They both needed answers, no matter the cost. As dusk settled, Evelyn wandered to the broken window, staring out at the skeletal branches clawing at the sky. The mansion groaned around her, an ancient beast struggling against inevitable decay. She traced the outlines of the house's fading grandeur against the darkening clouds, feeling the weight of generations of silence pressing down on her shoulders. Her thoughts spiraled back to Margaret, her spectral form flickering in the wallpaper, the sorrowful eyes that haunted Evelyn's dreams. The family's secrets were no longer whispers or shifting patterns. They were raw, exposed wounds demanding to be faced. That night, as she lay on the creaking mattress in the guest room, Evelyn's mind refused to rest. The mansion's shadows lengthened, wrapping around her like a shroud. Somewhere in the darkness, the house whispered again, this time not just of decay, but of vengeance and forgotten promises. She was no longer merely restoring walls. She was unearthing a legacy of pain and betrayal. And with each secret revealed, the line between herself and the haunted mansion blurred further. The past was no longer a distant echo, it was an ever-present force, pulling her deeper into its cold embrace. Evelyn closed her eyes, hearing the faintest of whispers beneath the creak of the floorboards. It was a voice she'd come to know, soft, sorrowful, and filled with accusation. Remember me. The words echoed in the hollows of her mind as sleep finally claimed her, a fragile reprieve before the shadows returned with the dawn. Morning brought no relief. Evelyn awoke with the taste of dust on her tongue and the weight of the mansion's secrets pressing anew on her chest. Simon was already in the study, poring over another stack of documents. She joined him, her determination stealing. We need to follow this, she said, pointing to a faded ledger listing financial transactions. There's a pattern here, payments to unknown accounts shortly after Margaret's death. Simon nodded, leaning closer. Bribes, to silence anyone who might speak out. Together, they traced the web of deceit, each piece of evidence tightening the noose around the Blackwood family's legacy. The mansion seemed to pulse with the revelations, its fading wallpaper now a map of betrayal and sorrow. Evelyn's hands shook as she documented every discovery, the line between historian and haunted restorer blurring irrevocably. She could feel Margaret's presence growing stronger, the house's whispers more insistent. This isn't just about restoring a building, Evelyn whispered. It's about bringing justice to a voice long silenced. Simon glanced at her, a shadow of doubt in his eyes, but also respect. Then we'd best prepare ourselves. The truth has a way of changing everything. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose shutters as the mansion stood defiant against the gathering storm. Within its walls, the past stirred, ready to reclaim its place in the present, and Evelyn was caught in its relentless tide. What price would she pay to uncover the full story? And could she survive the unmasking of truths so deeply buried? The answers waited in the shifting patterns of the wallpaper, in the whispered voices of the house, and in the shadows that refused to fade. Evelyn Harper was about to find out. The house seemed to breathe around me, its ancient walls expanding and contracting with a rhythm I could neither explain nor resist. In the dim light of the parlor, the wallpaper's faded patterns twisted and writhed, as if alive. I blinked, hoping my tired eyes were playing tricks on me, but the shifting forms persisted, flowers blooming into faces, vines curling into reaching hands. A cold chill slithered down my spine, the air thickening with a weight I could feel pressing from every corner. I staggered back, heart pounding, as the walls themselves seemed to lean inward, narrowing the room until the ceiling felt like it might collapse. Whispers rose from the peeling paper, soft at first, like a distant sigh. Then the murmurs grew louder, voices overlapping in a cacophony of sorrow and rage. The faintest fragments reached my ears, snatches of conversations, desperate pleas, and chilling laughter that echoed long after the sounds faded. Clutching the edge of a dusty table, I tried to steady my breath. This isn't real, I whispered to myself, but the house had other plans. The shadows stretched, twisting grotesquely across the cracked floorboards, and the once familiar scent of old wood and mildew turned metallic, sharp and biting. My hands trembled as I reached for my notes, the ink smeared from sweat and tears. Days blurred into nights, sleep became a stranger. Every creak and groan of the mansion jolted me awake, heart hammering against my ribs. I found myself talking aloud fragments of the whispers, names, dates, trying to piece together the unraveling story hidden beneath layers of decay. Yet the more I delved, the more the house seemed to push back, its presence growing darker, more suffocating. Simon's visit was a fragile tether to reality. He arrived quietly, his cautious eyes scanning the dim room cluttered with torn wallpaper and scattered papers. "Evelyn," he said gently, "you need to rest. This obsession is tearing you apart." I looked up, sensing the worry etched in his voice, but also the skepticism that always lingered. "I can't stop now," I replied, voice hoarse. "The house, it's speaking. I can't ignore it." He sighed, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "There's history here, yes. But you have to guard your mind. Don't let it consume you." His words echoed in my mind long after he left, but the mansion's grasp tightened with every passing hour. The walls shifted again, the wallpaper's images warping into a terrifying tableau of sorrow and violence. Faces emerged, Margaret's face, her sorrowful eyes pleading from within the faded paper. I reached out, fingers trembling, feeling an icy chill seep into my bones. Isolation became my refuge and my prison. I stopped answering the phone, avoided the contractor's calls, and ignored Mrs. Delaney's cryptic visits. Yet one evening, as twilight bled across the sky, the old woman appeared on the porch, her sharp eyes meeting mine with a knowing look. "You must protect yourself, Evelyn," she warned softly. "This house feeds on pain and fear. If you let it, it will swallow you whole." Her words hung heavy in the fading light. I nodded, but deep inside, I feared it was already too late. The mansion was no longer just wood and plaster, it was a living nightmare, and I was trapped within its shadows, my reality fracturing with every whispered secret and shifting wall. As night fell, the house's murmurs rose once more, a symphony of sorrow and rage that threatened to drown out my sanity. I knew the breaking point was near, and when the walls finally closed in, I would have to decide: fight for my mind or surrender to the darkness that had claimed Margaret and so many before me. But even in the depths of fear, A stubborn flame flickered within me. The truth was buried here, tangled in the decaying wallpaper and whispered voices. I would uncover it no matter the cost. The mansion was alive, and so was its past, and soon I would face both fractured reality and awe. The air in the mansion's kitchen was thick with dust and anticipation as I took a hesitant step forward, the worn wooden floor creaking beneath my boots. The faded wallpaper peeled away in strips around us, curling like forgotten memories clinging desperately to the walls. Across the battered kitchen table, Detective Harper sat with his arms folded, eyes sharp and unreadable. The dim light from a single hanging bulb cast long shadows that danced and trembled with every flicker of the flame from the small candle I had lit, a futile attempt to push back the pervasive gloom. "You never told me why this case matters so much to you," I said quietly, breaking the uneasy silence. "What is it about Margaret Blackwood that keeps you coming back?" He shifted in his seat, his gaze dropping to the scarred surface of the table. "It's not just about the case," he admitted finally. "There's history. Family history." My pulse quickened. I had sensed it before, the way his eyes lingered on certain corners of the house, the careful way he avoided some questions. "What kind of history?" Detective Harper ran a hand through his graying hair, his jaw tightening. "My mother worked here as a maid many years ago. She knew Margaret Blackwood better than most." The revelation hit me like a sudden cold draft. I took a breath, recalling the faded photographs and the brittle letters I'd found hidden in a loose floorboard days earlier. "Are you saying your family has been tied to this mansion longer than you let on?" He nodded slowly. "Yes. And that means this investigation is more personal than professional." A heavy silence settled between us as the weight of shared history began to fill the room, a history woven with secrets, loss, and unspoken pain. "Come," he said abruptly, standing and motioning for me to follow. "There's something I want to show you." We moved through the mansion's shadowed halls, the floorboards groaning beneath our feet like the house itself was sighing under the burden of its past. The whispers that had haunted me for weeks seemed to grow louder, swirling around us in indistinct murmurs. Each creak and rustle felt like a voice trying to reach out from the depths of the decaying walls. Detective Harper stopped before an old, ornate bookcase in the parlor, its wood chipped and faded. He pressed his palm against a carved floral pattern, and with a soft click, a hidden compartment popped open. Inside lay a collection of yellowed photographs and brittle letters, their edges curling with age. I reached in, my fingers trembling as I lifted a letter addressed in elegant, looping script to Mrs. Harper. My breath caught as I realized the letter was meant for the detective's mother. The words inside spoke of fear, betrayal, and a desperate plea for justice. This changes everything," I whispered, the connection between our families suddenly undeniable. Detective Harper's eyes glistened with a mixture of sorrow and resolve. "It explains why the case was buried for so long. The Blackwoods wanted to silence everyone who knew the truth, including my mother." The room seemed to close in around us as the full weight of the mansion's dark legacy pressed down. But in that suffocating moment, a fragile bond formed between us, a shared determination to uncover the truth no matter the cost. We made our way back to the grand fireplace, its once majestic stonework cracked and blackened by time. The flickering candlelight illuminated our faces, itched with fatigue, but burning with renewed purpose. "We're in this together now," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. Detective Harper nodded, a rare softness breaking through his usual sternness. "No matter what we find, we'll face it side by side." As the shadows lengthened and the mansion seemed to breathe around us, I knew the path ahead would be fraught with danger, not just from the house's restless spirit, but from the buried sins of our own pasts. Yet for the first time, I felt less alone in the darkness. The whispers on the wallpaper had led me here, to a truth far more tangled and painful than I had imagined. And the only way forward was to confront it head-on. The night had settled into a thick, Oppressive silence by the time I found myself alone in the mansion's east wing, the pale light of my lamp casting long, wavering shadows on the peeling walls. The air was cooler here, heavier with the scent of damp plaster and aged wood. I had been stripping away the last layers of wallpaper in that cramped parlor for hours, my hands trembling slightly from exhaustion and the creeping unease that had settled over me since dusk. The patterns on the wallpaper, once faded and innocuous, began to shift subtly beneath my eyes. At first, it was nothing more than a trick of the light, the curling edges catching in the lamp's glow, but then the swirls seemed to ripple like disturbed water. A low murmur rose around me, almost imperceptible, a susurration of voices, distant and fragmented, like echoes trapped between walls. I paused, breath held, heart pounding, listening. The whispers swelled, weaving through the room like a spectral breeze. Fragments of sorrowful phrases drifted to my ears. Why did you leave me? She never told the truth. Forgive me. The wallpaper's surface began to darken, the once ornate floral design twisting into vague, mournful shapes. I blinked, and the shadows coalesced into something far more tangible, a figure, faint and wavering, emerging from the curling paper like a ghostly apparition stepping through a veil. My breath caught in my throat as the image sharpened, a woman, dressed in the heavy layers of Victorian finery, her eyes deep pools of sorrow and accusation. Margaret Blackwood. The woman I had only glimpsed before in fleeting patterns and whispered fragments now stood fully formed before me. An ethereal presence bound to the mansion's decaying walls. Her dress flowed as if caught in a slow, mournful breeze, and her pale face was etched with pain that transcended time. "Why do you disturb me?" she seemed to ask, her voice a soft lament that echoed directly within my mind rather than through the air. I swallowed hard, unable to tear my gaze away, feeling the weight of centuries pressing down upon me. The spectral figure raised a delicate hand, pointing towards a hidden seam in the wallpaper near the corner of the room. The temperature dropped sharply, frost forming on my breath as a whisper turned into a chilling wail. The mansion seemed to exhale, walls creaking and settling as if alive. Summoning every ounce of courage, I reached out, fingers trembling, but my hand passed through her like smoke. Her translucent form shimmered and flickered, anguish radiating from her like a tangible force. The whispers escalated into a chorus of cries, the sorrow of a life violently cut short filling the room with a palpable despair. I stumbled back against the wall, heart racing, mind reeling. The apparition lingered a moment longer, eyes locked on mine, before dissolving into the swirling patterns of the wallpaper, which began to peel away like a dying skin. Left alone in the sudden, suffocating silence, I sank to the floor, the gravity of what I had witnessed pressing down. This was no mere haunting. It was a desperate plea from a soul trapped in decay and betrayal. Margaret's sorrow was not just a memory, it was a living thing, woven into the very fabric of the house. As dawn threatened the horizon, I knew the path ahead was darker and more treacherous than I had imagined. The mansion's whispers had found a voice, and now it was up to me to listen and to answer. But at what cost? I wiped the cold sweat from my brow, my hands still shaking, and forced myself to rise. The wallpaper's shifting patterns seemed to watch, waiting, as if the house itself held its breath for what I would do next. The boundary between the past and present, between reality and madness, had thinned dangerously tonight, and I was no longer sure which side I stood on. The house was alive, and it was calling me deeper into its shadows. The dim light of the late afternoon filtered weakly through the grimy windows, casting long shadows across the parlor where I sat, pencil trembling in hand. The peeling wallpaper around me seemed almost alive, the faded floral patterns shifting imperceptibly, as if breathing in time with my quickened pulse. I tried to steady my sketch, but the lines blurred, and the image of Margaret Blackwood's sorrowful face would not hold still. Her ethereal eyes haunted the paper, swirling between grief and rage, a silent accusation pressing into my bones. I found myself speaking aloud, a habit that had grown since the whispers began. "I see you," I said, voice barely above a breath. "I hear you. Tell me what happened." But the house only responded with murmurs, fragments of long-forgotten conversations, twisting through the air like cobwebs scraping at my mind. Each night, the voices grew louder, more insistent, and I felt the walls closing in, pressing against my skin with a weight that was both physical and psychological. Sleep eluded me. When it came, it was fractured and haunted by visions of Margaret reaching out, her pale hand emerging from the wallpaper's shifting patterns. I barely noticed the days slipping past, my hands stained with dust and paint, my notebooks overflowing with frantic sketches and cryptic notes. Simon's voice echoed in my memory, tinged with both skepticism and concern. Evelyn, he had said just days ago, standing in the workshop with his glasses slightly askew, "This obsession, it's dangerous. You rechasing shadows, and it's costing you everything." I had brushed him off then, stubborn as ever, convinced that I was on the brink of uncovering truth, that Margaret's story was within my grasp. But his words lingered like a warning bell in the dark corridors of my mind. I knew he was right. My fingers trembled as I set down the pencil, my vision swimming with the house's decay that now mirrored my own unraveling. Mark had also noticed. Just last night, I caught him watching me with a mixture of fear and helplessness as I wandered the mansion's halls, whispering to the walls. The shadows twisted and bent, coiling around me like serpents. I was no longer certain where the house ended and I began. "Evelyn, you need to rest," Mark had urged quietly, his voice low in the empty kitchen. "This place is getting to you." I wanted to scream, to tell him that rest was impossible when the house demanded everything. That Margaret's eyes were watching, that the whispers would never cease until I uncovered the truth. Tonight, standing before a newly revealed patch of wallpaper, I felt the house breathe beneath my fingertips. The image of Margaret flickered and distorted, her spectral form shimmering as if alive. The sorrow etched into her face was unbearable, a weight pressing deep into my chest. The walls pulsed with a sinister rhythm, a heartbeat older than the mansion itself. I pressed my hand against the paper, feeling a coldness seep into my skin, a connection bridging past and present. "I will find you," I whispered, "and I will not let you fade into silence." But as the wallpaper shifted and the whispers rose to a crescendo, I realized with a chilling clarity that in seeking to give voice to the forgotten, I was losing my own. The mansion's obsession was mine now, an unrelenting grip that threatened to consume me entirely. And yet, despite the fear curling in my gut, I could not turn away. The past demanded reckoning, and I was its unwilling vessel, caught between decay and revelation, sanity and madness. The house was alive, and so was its sorrow. And I was already too deep within its shadows to escape. The night stretched on, the whispers growing louder, the walls closing in. Somewhere deep in the darkness, Margaret waited, her voice a fragile thread pulling me toward a truth I feared and craved in equal measure. I had become part of the mansion's story now, entwined forever in its haunting grip. The line between reality and nightmare blurred, and I wondered how far would I fall before I found the light. Or was I destined to be lost in the wallpaper's endless whispers forever? The evening settled over the mansion like a dense fog, thick and suffocating, pressing against the windows and seeping into the very bones of the house. I was startled by the soft knock at the heavy oak door. It was Mrs. Delaney, her silhouette framed by the dim glow of the fading twilight outside. The faded floral dress she wore seemed almost to blend into the peeling wallpaper behind her, as if she were part of the house itself. Her sharp eyes, however, held the weight of decades of secrets and sorrow, and they fixed on me with a quiet urgency. "Evelyn," she began, her voice low and trembling just slightly, "there are things you must understand about this place, things not found in books or ledgers." I nodded, motioning for her to enter. The parlor was cold, the air heavy with dust and the faint scent of decay. A single candle flickered on the mantel, its flame casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. Mrs. Delaney seated herself carefully in an aged armchair, her hands folding neatly in her lap. "You've seen the whispers, the images that shift beneath the wallpaper," she said, eyes drifting toward the walls as if they might listen. "They were not mere tricks of the light or your imagination. Margaret Blackwood didn't rest easy in her death." I swallowed hard, feeling the familiar squeeze of unease tighten in my chest. "What do you mean?" "Mrs. Delaney leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The house, it holds her pain, her anger. The walls remember everything. But there is a way perhaps to give her peace." Her words sent a chill skittering down my spine. "What way?" She reached into the pocket of her dress and produced a fragile scrap of paper, yellowed with age and worn at the edges. On it was drawn a symbol intricate, looping lines forming a circle around a small cross. She traced it gently with a trembling finger. "This," she said, "is a mark of binding, a prayer to hold restless spirits. It was once used by the house's original caretakers. If you can perform the ritual it represents, you might ease the unrest that grips the mansion." I stared at the symbol, feeling both hope and dread swirl within me. "But it's risky, isn't it?" Mrs. Delaney nodded slowly. "Yes. Spirits like Margaret's are tethered by pain and betrayal. Disturbing those bonds can bring release or fury. You must be prepared for both." The room seemed to grow colder, and I shivered despite my thick sweater. Suddenly, a gust of icy wind swept through the parlor, extinguishing the candle flame and plunging us into near darkness. The shadows deepened, and for a moment I thought I heard a faint, sorrowful sigh echoing through the walls. "Mrs. Delaney's eyes met mine in the darkness, unwavering and resolute. "You are the one who must decide, Evelyn. Will you face the darkness within, or will you let it consume you?" I felt the weight of her question pressing down on me, heavier than any dust or decay. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with peril. But it was the only way to bring an end to the whispers that haunted my nights and the shadows that clawed at my mind. As the candlelight flickered back to life, I nodded slowly. "Tell me what I must do." Mrs. Delaney smiled faintly, a glimmer of something almost tender in her wary gaze. "First you must gather what the house has hidden away, the relics that bind Margaret's story. Only then can the ritual begin." The night deepened outside, and with it, my resolve hardened. The mansion was no longer just a building in need of repair. It was a living, breathing enigma, its heart beating in sync with my own fears and hopes. Whatever lay ahead, I was entwined with its fate now. As Mrs. Delaney rose to leave, she paused at the door, turning back to me one last time. "Remember, Evelyn, some pasts refuse to rest quietly. But facing them is the only way to find peace." Her footsteps faded down the stone path, leaving me alone with the whispers and the shifting wallpaper. The house waited, patient and watchful, as I prepared to step further into the darkness toward truth, redemption, and perhaps, finally, release. The fragile hope Mrs. Delaney offered was a candle flickering against the heavy shadows. But in this mansion, where decay and secrets intertwined, even the smallest light could be swallowed whole. Yet I had no choice but to follow it, wherever it might lead. And so, the next chapter of this haunting restoration began not with tools or paint, but with whispered lore and a ritual poised on the edge of the unknown. The house's breath was cold against my neck, the wallpaper's patterns shifting silently as though waiting for my next move. I was not alone here, never had been, and perhaps never would be. But I would try, I had to, because some silences demanded to be broken. The cramped study was cloaked in the muted glow of a solitary lamp, its pale light casting long shadows over the cluttered desk, where Evelyn and Simon sat knee to knee. Around them, fragments of wallpaper, brittle and curling at the edges, lay scattered like pieces of a forgotten puzzle. Alongside them rested aged letters, their ink faded but still legible, yellowed by decades of neglect. A thick silence hung between the two, punctuated only by the occasional scratch of Simon's pen as he jotted notes in the margins of a weathered notebook. "Look here," Simon murmured, pointing to a sequence of symbols Evelyn had painstakingly documented over the last few weeks. "These aren't just random patterns. They're recoded messages." Evelyn leaned in, her breath catching as she traced the delicate shapes. Each swirl and curve seemed to pulse faintly, as though alive beneath the thinning paper. "I've seen these before," she whispered. "In the letters." Margaret's handwriting, Simon's brow furrowed. "So the wallpaper isn't just decorative, it's a ledger, a diary, a cry for help concealed behind layers of paint and neglect." The room seemed to close in, the air thick with a mix of dust and something less tangible, a lingering sorrow that seeped from the very walls. Evelyn's fingers trembled as she lifted a particularly fragile fragment, revealing beneath it a faded sketch of a woman in Victorian dress. The figure's eyes, rendered with haunting precision, mirrored the spectral images she had glimpsed in the wallpaper's shifting patterns. "Margaret," Evelyn breathed. "She's trying to tell us her story." Simon nodded slowly, adjusting his glasses. "And it's worse than we thought." They pored over the letters, piecing together a narrative of betrayal and violence hidden beneath the mansion's grandeur. Margaret Blackwood, once a wealthy heiress, was ensnared in a web of family deceit. Her death, long written off as an accident or suicide, was in fact a carefully concealed murder orchestrated by those closest to her. "This letter," Simon said, handing Evelyn a folded sheet edged with dried tears, "is a confession, or at least a hint of one." Evelyn unfolded it carefully, her eyes scanning the cramped script. The words spoke of guilt, fear, and a desperate plea for forgiveness. The writer, a Blackwood family member, had hidden it behind the wallpaper, hoping someone would find it and set the truth free. The wallpaper around them seemed to shimmer, the patterns flowing like a dark tide. Slowly, the fragmented images merged: the sorrowful woman, the accusing eyes, the shadowy figures lurking in the background, painting a spectral tableau of that fateful night. Evelyn felt the weight of history pressing down, the mansion's decay reflecting the corrosion of trust and love that had festered for decades. Simon tapped a finger against a worn family tree chart. "Here, this connects all the dots." He traced a shaky line linking names and dates, revealing alliances, betrayals, and the lengths to which the family had gone to suppress Margaret's murder. Evelyn's heart pounded as the scope of the conspiracy unfolded, a tale of greed, silence, and shattered lives. "We need to document this," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "For Margaret and for the house." Simon gave a small, resolute nod. "History deserves its truth, no matter how dark." As they continued to work through the night, the mansion around them seemed to breathe with renewed life. The whispers in the wallpaper now a chorus of voices freed from silence. Yet beneath the revelation lay an ache, a reminder that some wounds never fully heal, that the past's shadows linger long after the dust has settled. Evelyn paused, fingers resting lightly on the peeling paper. The puzzle was nearly complete, but the cost of knowing weighed heavy. She glanced at Simon, who met her gaze with quiet understanding. "What happens now?" she asked. Simon's eyes reflected the flickering lamp. "Now we make sure the story is heard, and we prepare for whatever comes next." Outside, the wind whispered through the broken windows, carrying with it the faintest echo of a woman's voice, soft, sorrowful, yet resolute. The mansion had given up its secrets, but its whispers would endure, a testament to the fragile line between memory and oblivion. Evelyn took a deep breath, steeling herself for the final steps of this journey. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the true challenge lay ahead, confronting the lingering darkness and the fragile truths etched beneath the wallpaper's fading patterns. As dawn's pale light seeped through the cracked panes, the mansion stood silent but alive, its stories no longer hidden in shadows. And Evelyn, forever changed, understood that some mysteries never truly end, they only wait for the right eyes to see, and the right hearts to listen. I stood just beyond the iron gate, the mansion's silhouette etched against a bleak, grey sky, its sharp gables and towering chimneys casting long shadows over the overgrown garden. The wind stirred the dry leaves at my feet, and the scent of damp earth and decay hung heavily in the air. It was exactly as the brochure had described, abandoned, decrepit, forgotten. But as I gazed upward, a strange shiver ran down my spine, and I hesitated, fingers tightening around the worn leather strap of my tool bag. The wrought iron gate protested with a creak as I pushed it open, stepping onto the cracked stone path. Ivy strangled the brickwork, and the once grand oak doors bore scars of time and neglect. I inhaled deeply, tasting the dust and memories that clung to the air, and pushed the heavy door open. It gave way with a groan, revealing a darkened foyer where shafts of late afternoon sunlight fought through grime-coated windows. Dust hung in the air like a haze, swirling around me as I crossed the threshold. The wooden floorboards creaked beneath my boots, and the scent of mildew and old wood filled my nostrils. My eyes immediately caught the faded wallpaper peeling at the edges, its floral patterns dulled and cracked, but still stubbornly clinging to the walls. As I reached out to brush away a loose fragment, a faint ripple seemed to pass beneath my fingers, an illusion. Surely born of exhaustion and the house's gloom. I set down my bag and began unpacking, brushes, scrapers, solvents, the tools of my trade. As I worked, I noted the wallpaper's strange qualities. The patterns seemed to shift subtly when I wasn't looking directly, the flowers and vines twisting almost imperceptibly. I shook the thought away, blaming shadows and the failing light. When night fell, the house transformed. The silence deepened, broken only by the creaks and sighs of shifting wood. I sat in the dim glow of my lantern, documenting the day's progress in my notebook. Then I heard it, a soft murmur like distant voices caught on the breeze, faint and fragmented. I froze, heart pounding, straining to catch the words. But they slipped away, leaving only a hollow echo in the silence. I convinced myself it was the wind or the house settling. Yet as I moved through the shadowed rooms, I felt eyes watching, whispers brushing the edges of my mind. The wallpaper seemed alive, its patterns crawling and weaving stories I could almost grasp. Unease twisted with fascination as I realized this was no ordinary restoration. The mansion held secrets, and I was drawn inexorably toward them. Sleep was elusive that night, my mind replaying the murmurs, the flicker of shapes behind torn paper. I resolved to uncover the stories hidden beneath those faded florals, to breathe life back into these decaying walls. Whatever haunted this house, I would face it. Because sometimes, to restore the past, you have to listen to the whispers in the wallpaper. But as I lay awake, the shadows lengthened, and the house sighed around me. I wondered if I was really prepared for what I might find. Morning brought a pale light that filtered weakly through stained glass. I rose early, compelled to return to the wall that had caught my attention the night before. There, amid the peeling layers, patterns danced again, shapes shifting just beyond clarity. I traced them with my eyes, heart quickening. The house was no longer just a building. It was a presence, a story waiting to be told, and I was its reluctant confidant. The restoration had begun, but so had the unraveling. I stared back at the wallpaper, determined to see beyond the decay. What truths lay hidden in those shifting patterns, and what voices whispered from their depths? I didn't yet know, but I had to find out. And so, the mansion welcomed me not as a mere restorer, but as a listener to its haunted past. The whispers had begun, and with them, the first threads of a story that would change everything. The house seemed to breathe around me, its walls contracting with a slow, relentless pressure that pressed against my chest. The wallpaper, the very fabric of the mansion's skin, morphed and shifted beneath my gaze. The faded floral patterns twisting into grotesque shapes that danced in the flickering light of my flashlight. Whispers swelled into murmurs, murmurs into voices, voices into screams that reverberated through the hollow halls, echoing off the cracked plaster and warped wood. I stood at the epicenter of a building alive with decay and memory, and the weight of its sorrow bore down on me like a physical force. The air was thick, heavy with dust and the scent of mold, But beneath that I caught something else, something metallic, like blood long dried but refusing to fade. My breath came in shallow bursts, fogging the glass of my glasses as I clasped my trembling hands to my sides, fighting the urge to collapse. The wallpaper around me rippled, the colors darkening, the patterns coalescing into a visage both ethereal and heart-wrenching. Margaret's face appeared, pale and flickering like a candle flame in a draught, her eyes deep wells of sorrow and accusation that seemed to pierce straight through me. "Why won't you listen?" Her voice whispered just beyond comprehension, a fragile thread of sound that wound through my mind. I staggered back, my fingers clawing at the peeling paper, desperate to understand, to grasp the story hidden beneath years of rotten silence. The walls groaned, a low, mournful sound that filled the space like a dirge. The mansion was mourning, and I was caught in the center of its grief. As the spectral whispers surged, my vision blurred and fragmented. Faces, some familiar, some strange, flickered in the periphery, shadows of lives long past. The wallpaper's patterns stretched and contracted, and I felt the walls closing in, the space shrinking until I was trapped in a chamber of decay and voices. Panic clawed at my throat. The line between reality and hallucination dissolved beneath the mansion's oppressive weight. I sank to my knees, clutching the cold plaster wall for support as the cacophony of voices turned to screams inside my head. Fragments of conversations, pleas, threats, laughter, weeping overlapped in a maddening symphony. My heart hammered in my chest, and tears blurred my sight as the house's sorrow became my own. The wallpaper's shifting images merged into a single, terrible truth. The mansion was a vessel of pain, and I was its unwilling keeper. Minutes, hours, time lost all meaning as I teetered on the edge of collapse. Yet, amid the chaos, a fragile thread of clarity emerged. I forced myself upright, hands shaking but determined, and gripped my notepad and flashlight like lifelines. The truth was here, buried beneath layers of peeling paper and broken promises, and I could not let it slip away, not now, not after coming so far. I whispered to the house, my voice raw but steady. "Show me, tell me what happened. I won't turn away." The walls seemed to pulse in response, the whispers quieting to a mournful sigh. Margaret's face lingered a moment longer, sorrow giving way to a faint glimmer of hope, before fading back into the decaying wallpaper. The mansion's breath slowed, and though the oppressive weight remained, I felt a small victory, a promise that the past could be faced and perhaps laid to rest. But as I steadied myself, preparing to delve deeper into the shadows, a cold certainty settled over me. This breaking point was only the beginning. The house's secrets were still alive, and so was the darkness that guarded them. The question was no longer whether I could uncover the truth, but whether I could survive the price of knowing it. I took a deep breath, the stale air filling my lungs like a bitter draught. The mansion was watching, waiting, and I was ready to face whatever came next, no matter the cost. The breaking point had come. Now, the reckoning awaited. The air inside the mansion was thick with dust and the scent of aged paper as I spread out the fragile, yellowed letters across the ancient oak table in the hidden room. Each letter was a thread pulling me deeper into the past, a past that had been buried beneath layers of wallpaper and lies for decades. My fingers trembled, not from the cold, but from the weight of what I was about to uncover. The whispered voices that had haunted me for so long now seemed to crystallize into something tangible, something real. With every line I read, a clearer picture emerged: Margaret Blackwood's life, her fear, her desperation, and ultimately her tragic end. Detective Harper stood nearby, his brow furrowed with a solemn seriousness that matched the gravity of the moment. I glanced at Simon, who adjusted his glasses nervously, his usual skepticism softened by the undeniable evidence before us. The faded photographs, the ink-stained confessions, the cryptic diary entries all pointed to a truth that the Blackwood family had fought fiercely to conceal. Margaret's murder was no accident, no random act of violence. It was a calculated, cold-blooded act born of greed and shame. It was the family, Harper said quietly, breaking the silence. They wanted to protect their name, their fortune. Margaret threatened to expose secrets that would have destroyed them. They silenced her. His voice was steady, but the weight of those words filled the room like a suffocating fog. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as the wallpaper around us seemed to ripple faintly, as if the house itself was listening, acknowledging this long-awaited confession. The sorrowful figure I had glimpsed so many times now stood before me in a spectral shimmer. Margaret, caught between worlds, her eyes filled with both accusation and a strange relief. The mansion, with all its decay and secrets, had finally spoken clearly. Simon stepped forward, his voice shaking slightly. This changes everything we thought we knew. The cover-up, the silence, the years of denial, it's all connected to this family conspiracy. We owe it to Margaret to bring this to light. I nodded, swallowing hard. The truth was a heavy burden, one that pressed down on my chest with relentless force. Yet beneath the weight was a fragile thread of hope that by unveiling this darkness, perhaps we could finally bring some peace to a restless soul and begin to heal the wounds that had festered here for so long. The following days were a whirlwind of interviews, paperwork, and painstaking collaboration with local authorities. Detective Harper's methodical approach complemented my obsessive need for detail as we pieced together the final puzzle. Each new witness, each corroborated fact chipped away at the wall of silence that had protected the Blackwood family's darkest secret. Sometimes I caught myself staring at the wallpaper, now stripped mostly bare, the faintest traces of Margaret's image lingering like a ghostly watermark. The house was quieter, but the echoes of its past still whispered in the corners of my mind. I realized then that the mansion was not just a building to be restored. It was a vessel of memories, pain, and truths that refused to be buried. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the cracked tiles, Detective Harper and I stood in the main hall. He turned to me, his eyes reflecting the dim light. "You've done what no one else could, Evelyn. You've given Margaret a voice." I swallowed the lump in my throat, but at what cost? He nodded knowingly. The past never truly dies, it lingers, shapes us. But sometimes, facing it is the only way forward. The mansion creaked around us, the walls settling as if acknowledging a chapter closed, yet another beginning. I stepped outside into the cool night air, the first stars twinkling overhead. The garden was overgrown, wild, but alive, much like the story that had finally been told. Though the truth had surfaced, I knew the shadows within the mansion and within myself would never fully fade. But in that moment, beneath the vast expanse of sky, I allowed myself a fragile hope that the whispers would someday quiet and the house could finally rest. As I turned back to look once more at the grand facade, a soft breeze stirred the air, carrying with it the faintest murmur of a voice, a whisper of thanks, or perhaps a warning. Either way, I was ready to listen. The afternoon sun cast a soft, golden glow through the tall windows of the Victorian mansion, illuminating the freshly restored walls where once the peeling wallpaper had whispered secrets that clawed at the edges of my sanity. The heavy atmosphere that had pressed upon me like a shroud was lifting, replaced by a tentative calm that seemed almost alien after months of oppressive gloom. I stood in the center of the main parlor, the scent of fresh paint mingling with the lingering musk of old wood and dust, and took a deep breath, allowing myself to feel the quiet for the first time in what felt like ages. The house had changed. The decay that had once seeped into every crevice was no longer a living thing, no longer a suffocating presence that bent the very air. Yet, despite the visible restoration, something beneath the surface had shifted only slightly, as if the mansion's souls still stirred quietly beneath the veneer of renewal. I traced my fingers along the edge of a faded fragment of wallpaper. I had carefully preserved a tiny remnant of the sorrowful figure, whose image had first drawn me into this labyrinth of whispers and shadows. It was fragile, its colors muted, the delicate swirls of the pattern worn thin, but it held within it the echo of a story I could no longer forget. Sitting cross-legged on the worn wooden floor, my tools and notebooks scattered around me like the remnants of a long battle, I felt the weight of what I had uncovered settle in my chest. The house had demanded so much my time, my sanity, my very sense of reality, and yet it had given me something else in return, a painful clarity, a reckoning with ghosts both literal and figurative. Simon Clarke's cautious footsteps approached, his presence a steadying anchor amidst the swirling thoughts. He lingered near the doorway, adjusting his glasses as he regarded the room with a mixture of satisfaction and relief. "It's remarkable," he said quietly. "You've done a fine job bringing this place back to life." Mark Benson emerged from the adjacent hallway, wiping his hands on a rag. His practical demeanor a reassuring contrast to the ethereal weight that still clung to the mansion's corners. "Can't believe it's the same place," he added, his voice warm but measured. "Feels less like a tome now." Their words grounded me, reminding me that I was not alone in this journey even when the house had tried so hard to isolate me within its shifting walls and murmuring wallpaper. The tension that had once cracked between Simon's skepticism and my obsession had softened into a cautious camaraderie. Mark's straightforward pragmatism was a balm to my frayed nerves. As the afternoon waned, I rose and moved toward the window, watching dust motes dance in the fading light. The mansion's silence was almost complete, save for the faint creaks and sighs of an old house settling into peace. But then, just for a moment, my gaze caught a subtle ripple in the wallpaper. Near the corner, a barely perceptible shift in pattern, like a breath drawn beneath the surface. I blinked, heart quickening. The whisper was there still, faint and elusive, a reminder that some stories refuse to be silenced entirely. Margaret Blackwood's sorrow, the weight of secrets buried beneath layers of time and decay, lingered in the very fabric of the walls. A shiver ran down my spine, tempered by a strange comfort. I had crossed a threshold from pragmatic restorer to keeper of a haunted legacy. The mansion's whispers would always echo in my mind, but they no longer held the power to imprison me. I turned back to Simon and Mark, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of dusk, and felt a fragile hope stir within me. The past was not gone. It was woven into the present, shaping us in ways seen and unseen. My own story was forever intertwined with this house, its decay, its voices, and its shifting shadows. As night fell outside, I gathered my notes and tools, ready to leave the mansion for the evening. The house was quiet now, but I knew the whispers would wait, patient and persistent, beneath the wallpaper's surface. And so would I, changed, wary, but no longer afraid. Because sometimes the cost of truth is a lifetime's shadow, but it is also the path to understanding and, perhaps, to peace. I paused at the doorway, casting one last glance at the room bathed in moonlight, the delicate patterns on the walls seeming to pulse softly in the dark. The mansion's story was far from over, and neither was mine. With a steadying breath, I stepped outside, the cool night air wrapping around me like a promise. The whispers would follow, but I was no longer lost in their echo. I was their witness now, the keeper of a past that refused to fade. And as the door closed behind me, the house exhaled a slow, mournful sigh that settled into the silence, waiting for the next chapter to unfold. The mansion had lost some of its oppressive weight now that the restoration was nearing completion. The walls gleamed faintly under the soft afternoon light filtering through the tall, dusty windows, and the once peeling wallpaper had been carefully repaired, its delicate patterns restored to something close to their former glory. Yet, as I stood alone in the main parlor, the stillness felt fragile, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I approached the wall, where a particularly intricate floral motif spread across the surface, its colors richer than I remembered from before the repairs. But as I drew near, a strange sensation prickled at the back of my neck, a subtle unease that I couldn't shake. The patterns seemed to ripple, shifting ever so slightly, as if stirred by an unseen breeze. Then, faintly, the whispers returned, soft, indistinct murmurs threading through the silence like half-forgotten memories. I froze, heart-pounding, listening as fragments of voices brushed past me, carried on currents that no one else could hear. "Do you hear it too?" The voice startled me, breaking the fragile spell. Simon stood just inside the doorway, his brow furrowed, eyes sharp behind his glasses. "Yes," I whispered, though a part of me wished I could deny it. "The wallpaper, it still moves. The whispers haven't stopped." Simon stepped closer, his gaze fixed on the wall. For a long moment, he said nothing, as if weighing the reality of what I was describing. Then, faintly, the patterns shifted again, and in the corner of my eye, I caught the outline of a face, sorrowful, ethereal, emerging from the swirling designs. It was Margaret, or at least the memory of her, etched forever into the fabric of the house. "I don't know if the house ever lets go," Simon murmured. "Some stories stay alive in the places where they happened." The words echoed my own thoughts. Even with the truth uncovered, the mansion held onto its secrets not out of malice, but because they were part of its very being. I found myself drawn to a quiet corner by the fireplace that evening, my journal open but untouched. The house creaked softly around me, settling into the night, and the whispers returned gentler now, almost like a lullaby looping through my mind. I closed my eyes and let the sounds wash over me. They were fragments of sorrow and rage, of love and betrayal, a chorus of voices that had once been silenced but refused to be forgotten. The wallpaper's patterns shifted faintly in the flickering firelight, weaving stories I could almost piece together, yet never fully grasp. In the dim hallway, as a cool breeze stirred the heavy curtains, I caught another glimpse, fleeting and delicate, of the wallpaper rearranging itself. It was a silent reminder that the mansion's past was not simply a chapter to be closed, but a living presence that would continue to shape the present. I realized then that the restoration was more than just physical repair. It was an act of listening, a fragile truce between the living and the echoes that lingered in the walls. The mansion's whispers had become a part of me, woven into the fabric of my thoughts and dreams. Could I ever truly leave it behind? Or would the shadows beneath the wallpaper always follow me, a persistent murmur beneath the surface of my mind? I didn't have the answer. But as I turned off the lights and stepped out into the cool night air, I knew one thing for certain: some pasts never fade completely. They whisper in the wallpaper, shifting just beyond the edge of sight, waiting to be heard again. And I would listen, for as long as it took. The morning sun seeped weakly through a pale sky as I stood on the creaking porch of the Victorian mansion one last time. The house, dignified once more but still bearing the scars of its long decay, loomed silently behind me. Its restored facade a ghostly monument to the past it refused to let go. For all the care I had poured into peeling back its layers, smoothing its fractures, and breathing new life into its walls, the mansion held its secrets close, whispering to me in the spaces between silence and sound. I reached out to touch the freshly painted doorframe, the wood cool beneath my fingers, and for a moment, I thought I heard a faint murmur so soft I questioned whether it was my mind playing tricks. The wallpaper, once a shifting tapestry of sorrow and rage, had been stripped away or concealed beneath layers of fresh plaster and paint. Yet, in the quiet, the house seemed to breathe, its voice lingering like a faint echo I couldn't quite forget. Inside, the grand hall stretched wide and empty, the floorboards gleaming where dust no longer settled, the air lighter than it had been in months. I walked slowly, my footsteps muted against the polished wood, my gaze tracing the walls where the last remnants of the wallpaper's ghostly patterns had been covered. The sorrowful eyes of Margaret Blackwood no longer shimmered in the peeling paper, but their memory was etched deeply into the house's bones and mine. I paused before the staircase, the ornate banister smooth to the touch. Here the past and present seemed to collide, layers of time folding over one another like the intricate patterns I had once studied so obsessively. The whispers that had haunted me, fragments of conversations, cries frozen in time, were silent now, or perhaps simply waiting for another ear to listen. I felt the weight of that silence pressing against my chest, a bittersweet ache. Outside, the garden had begun reclaiming its wildness, vines curling up the sides of the house, flowers blooming defiantly among the cracked stone paths. Mrs. Delaney's warnings echoed in my mind. The mansion's legacy was not one easily laid to rest. Her cryptic words had stayed with me. Some shadows refuse to fade, no matter how brightly you shine a light. Simon Clark had visited earlier that week, his pragmatic skepticism softened by a reluctant respect for the mansion's mysteries. We had shared a quiet conversation over tea, the tension between history and haunting momentarily eased by mutual understanding. He had reminded me that truth often wears many faces, and sometimes the stories we uncover are as much about ourselves as the past we seek to expose. As I prepared my final tools, packing away brushes and notebooks stained with faded ink and dust, a sudden chill brushed past my neck. I turned sharply, half expecting to see a shadow flicker in the corner of my eye. Instead, there was only silence, a silence that felt heavy, as if the house were holding its breath, bidding me farewell, or perhaps warning me against forgetting. I stepped outside, the cool morning air wrapping around me. The path ahead was overgrown, tangled with weeds and wild flowers, much like the tangled truths I had uncovered within these walls. I glanced back once more, catching the faintest movement in an upper window, an indistinct figure, a flicker of sorrowful eyes that vanished when I blinked. I swallowed hard, the weight of what I had learned settling deep within my bones. The mansion was restored, its physical form renewed, but the whispers, the shadows, the echoes they were enduring, woven into the very fabric of the house and now into me. I took a step forward, then another, the sound of my boots soft against the earth. With each pace away from the mansion, the past receded but did not disappear. It followed me like a shadow, a reminder that some histories refuse to be silenced, and some voices linger long after the walls have been rebuilt. As I disappeared down the winding path, the mansion stood still, watching, waiting, its whispers fading into the dawn but never truly gone. And neither was I. The house had given up its secrets, but it had claimed a part of me in return, a lasting whisper in the wallpaper of my mind. I had arrived at the mansion the day before, a place so steeped in neglect that the very air seemed heavy with a silence older than memory. Today the work began in earnest. Armed with a scraper, a dim lantern, and an old notebook, I faced the peeling walls that whispered secrets I was only beginning to understand. The wallpaper was a puzzle, layers upon layers, each a fragment of a bygone era. As I carefully lifted the brittle edges of the topmost sheet, a faint murmur tickled the edge of my senses. It was almost imperceptible, like the wind sifting through dead leaves, but it made my skin prickle. I paused, heart hammering, and listened. Silence, then again, a barely audible breath of sound. I could not tell if it was my own imagination or something else. With trembling hands, I pried away more of the paper, revealing a faded floral pattern underneath, worn and stained with time. Yet beneath the pattern, something else shifted in the gloom, a shadow, a shape that wavered like smoke caught in the morning light. I blinked hard, trying to focus. Was it a trick of the dimness, or the first hint of the mansion's hidden story revealing itself? I moved methodically, setting down my tools to sketch the delicate, curling motifs. My pencil traced the fragile outlines, but the images seemed to shift beneath my gaze, as if the walls themselves breathed and rearranged in the half-light. The whispers grew stronger, fragments of syllables, sorrowful sighs, a faint echo of laughter or crying. I could not tell which. The house was alive, or at least it felt that way. I felt a strange affinity with this decay, as if the mansion's slow rot mirrored my own fractured past, my need to uncover and restore something lost. Yet unease crept in, a tightening in my chest. Was I losing myself in the dust and shadows? I forced myself to focus. This was no ordinary restoration job. The wallpaper was a palimpsest, layers of memory and pain pressed into paper and plaster. Each scrap I removed was like peeling back the skin of the house, revealing wounds beneath. By late afternoon, the room was littered with torn paper and cracked plaster. I sat back on my heels, breathing heavily, and reviewed my notes. The patterns I had sketched seemed almost like messages, symbols waiting to be deciphered. The whispers had faded with the daylight, but the sensation lingered as if the mansion was watching, waiting. I talked to myself, as I often did in moments of solitude, voicing theories and doubts aloud. "What are you trying to tell me?" I whispered to the empty room, my voice trembling. There was no answer, only the creak of aged wood and a distant, faint sigh that might have been the wind or something else. By evening, exhaustion weighed on me, but the seed of obsession had taken root. I was no longer just a restorer. I was a seeker of truths buried deep beneath the patterns and decay. The mansion had begun to speak, and I was listening, even if it unsettled me to the core. As I packed away my tools, I glanced back at the wall one last time. The faintest shape lingered in the peeling paper, a sorrowful face, perhaps, or the hint of a hand reaching out. I shivered, not from cold, but from the undeniable sense that I had crossed a threshold. This house held its secrets tightly, but it was beginning to unravel them for me. Tomorrow I would return, and I would listen more closely to the whispers beneath the wallpaper. The night settled around the mansion like a shroud, and as I lay awake in the sparse guest room, I thought I heard the faintest echo of a voice calling my name. Or maybe it was just the wind. Either way, I could no longer deny it. The house was alive, and it had stories to tell. With every layer I stripped away, the past edged closer, and I was powerless to resist its pull. The restoration had truly begun. The day had begun with the usual quiet that settled over the mansion like a heavy shroud. Its oppressive silence broken only by the occasional scrape of Evelyn's tools against the brittle layers of wallpaper. But today, something was different. The air felt charged, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for her to listen. Evelyn sat cross-legged on the floor of the main parlor, a thin beam of afternoon light filtering through the grimy window panes and casting long shadows across the worn floorboards. The wallpaper before her was a tapestry of faded florals, curling at the edges and peeling away in tatters. With gentle, precise movements, she peeled back another fragment, revealing a layer beneath that was even older, its patterns more intricate, but marred by time. A soft murmur rose around her, barely audible, like a distant conversation just out of reach. She paused, breath hitching. Was it her imagination? Yet the sound persisted, growing more distinct with each moment. She sat still enough to hear it. It was a whisper, fragmented and ethereal, threads of voices intertwining in a ghostly chorus. Leaning closer, Evelyn strained to catch the words. They were broken phrases, laden with sorrow and fear, fragments of conversations lost to time, but somehow preserved within these walls. "Don't leave me." One voice pleaded, trembling and fragile. Another murmured, "You promised, you swore." Her heart quickened. The mansion was speaking, revealing secrets hidden beneath decades of neglect. A cold shiver traced her spine as the whispers swirled, teasing her senses, tugging at the edges of her reason. Doubt crept in. Was this the house, or her mind conjuring ghosts from loneliness and exhaustion? She brushed the thought aside. She needed to document this. Pulling her notebook closer, she scribbled down the phrases, the faintest hints of language that might lead her to the truth buried here. As twilight deepened the gloom, Evelyn's eyes caught movement in the wallpaper. The patterns seemed to ripple, shifting subtly as if alive. A sorrowful female figure emerged from the faded swirls, a pale woman in a Victorian dress, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. The image was fleeting, vanishing when Evelyn blinked, but the impression it left was indelible. "Who are you?" She whispered into the quiet room, her voice trembling. The whispers responded, a chorus of fractured emotions, regret, fear, despair. Evelyn felt the weight of their stories pressing in, the mansion's decay mirroring the emotional ruin they bore. She found herself talking aloud, a habit she couldn't suppress. "I hear you. I see you. I will find your story." The night deepened, shadows pooling in the corners, the murmurs growing louder, filling the room with a spectral hum. Evelyn's fingers traced the cryptic symbols she had begun to note, a mixture of faded letters and strange marks concealed in the wallpaper's design. Each clue pulled her deeper into the mansion's history, unraveling a tapestry woven with tragedy and silence. Yet the more she uncovered, the more the walls seemed to close in. The house was no longer merely a building. It was a living entity, breathing memories and secrets through its crumbling skin. Evelyn's resolve hardened, even as a subtle unease settled in her bones. Could she trust her senses? Or was she losing herself to the house's whispers? The question lingered, unanswered, as the night stretched on and the mansion whispered on. With every fragment of voice, every shifting image, Evelyn felt herself drawn irrevocably into a story that was no longer just history, it was becoming her own. The wallpaper was no longer just decoration, it was a veil between worlds, a fragile barrier threatening to tear. And she was determined to see what lay beneath. The late afternoon sun filtered weakly through the grimy panes of the mansion's front windows, as I heard the crunch of footsteps on the gravel driveway. I glanced up from my scattered notes and wallpaper samples, heart quickening. The moment I'd anticipated with a mix of eagerness and dread had arrived. Simon Clark was here. When the door creaked open, a man stepped inside, his figure casting a long, cautious shadow across the dust motes that swirled in the stale air. Simon was of average height, his frame somewhat stooped, his carefully trimmed hair peppered with grey. The glasses perched on his nose gave him an air of studious seriousness, while his tweed jacket, frayed slightly at the elbows, marked him as a man of habit and tradition. "Ms. Harper," he asked, voice measured but polite. I nodded, wiping my hands on the worn fabric of my work shirt. "Simon Clark, thank you for coming." He stepped fully inside, eyes sweeping the room with a practiced gaze. "Quite the place," he murmured, almost to himself. "I can see why you were drawn here." I gestured toward the peeling wallpaper, the faded florals curling at the edges like dying leaves. "It's more than the architecture. There's something unsettled about this house. The patterns change, almost as if the walls are alive." Simon raised an eyebrow skeptically. "Walls don't change, Ms. Harper. But history does leave its mark." We settled near the hearth, which held only cold ashes, the silence between us thick with unspoken questions. Simon pulled a leather satchel from his bag and carefully removed a worn ledger, its pages yellowed and brittle. "I've been researching the Blackwood family for years," he said, flipping to a page dense with handwritten entries. Margaret Blackwood's name appears here frequently, along with dates that seem to correlate with some of the mansion's renovations. I leaned in, tracing the faded ink with a finger. "Do you think the family's history might explain the disturbances?" Simon looked up sharply, meeting my gaze with steady eyes. "History explains everything, but not always the way we want it to." The conversation turned to facts, ownership records, rumors of scandal, and the whispered tales that had grown like ivy around the mansion's crumbling facade. Simon's pragmatic tone grounded the discussion, but I couldn't help but notice how his presence contrasted with the growing voice inside me, the one that heard whispers beneath the wallpaper, saw shadows shift in the corners of my vision. As dusk deepened, long shadows stretched across the room, and the fading light cast the wallpaper in eerie relief. Simon's eyes scanned the ledger, oblivious to the faint murmurs that rose around us, the almost imperceptible sighs of the house itself. I felt a shiver run down my spine, a sudden wave of isolation despite the company. It was clear our paths diverged here, his rooted in documented history, mine pulling me toward the spectral and unknown. Yet, in that fragile moment of uneasy alliance, I knew we needed each other. History and intuition, fact and fear, skepticism and obsession, all threads weaving the tapestry of this house's story. And I was determined to unravel every one. "Tomorrow," Simon said, closing the ledger and standing, I'll gather more records from the town archives. If there's anything concrete to find, I'll find it. I nodded, the weight of the coming days settling heavily on my shoulders. And I'll keep listening to the house, to the walls. Maybe together we'll uncover what's been buried too long. As Simon's footsteps faded down the driveway, the whispers curled around me once more, and the wallpaper's patterns seemed to pulse faintly in the twilight. The mansion had welcomed a new visitor, but it was clear the house's secrets were not yet ready to be revealed. The line between history and haunting had just begun to blur, and I was caught between two worlds, one of facts, the other of shadows. The question was which would claim me first. I returned to my notes, the scratch of my pen a small defiance against the growing silence. I had work to do, and the mansion was waiting, and somewhere, deep in the shifting patterns of the wallpaper, Margaret Blackwood watched and waited too. As night fell, the house breathed around me, alive with stories yet untold. I wasn't sure where this path would lead, but I knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same again here. And the whispers, they were only just beginning. The air in the grand room held a heavy stillness, as if time itself hesitated to move forward within these decaying walls. I knelt before the peeling wallpaper, the brittle edges crumbling at my touch like fragile memories slipping away. Layer by layer, the faded patterns gave way, revealing not just the paper beneath, but whispers, soft, almost imperceptible murmurs that seemed to breathe beneath the surface. Tonight the whispers were clearer, more insistent. My fingers paused on a section where the wallpaper's once elaborate floral design had been interrupted by a delicate, sorrowful figure. At first it was barely visible, a shadow of a woman rendered in faded hues of grey and blue, her eyes downcast, lips pressed into a thin line of quiet despair. I traced the contours gently, afraid to disturb more than the paper, as if the image might shatter like glass. A shiver ran through me, and I glanced around the room. The mansion's grandeur had long since succumbed to rot and neglect. The walls sagged under the weight of decades. The floorboards creaked with mournful groans. Yet here, in this fragment of wallpaper, was a whisper of someone's sorrow, someone's story etched into the very fabric of the house. The voices stirred again, weaving through the silence with aching clarity. Snatches of conversation floated to my ears, a woman's soft sobs, a hurried, hushed exchange, the sharp edge of fear. I pressed my hand to my chest, heart pounding as the room seemed to close in around me. The decay wasn't just physical. It was emotional, a weight pressing down on my shoulders, mingling with the ghosts of my own failures. I remembered the last time I had felt such helplessness, when my life had unraveled, when the past I'd tried to bury clawed its way back into the present. Here, beneath the peeling wallpaper, the mansion whispered secrets I had no choice but to listen to. The sorrowful woman's eyes seemed to meet mine, imploring me to understand, to remember. I reached for my notebook, the lantern casting flickering shadows across the room. Every detail mattered: the faded brush strokes, the pattern's subtle shifts, the way the whispers seemed to pulse in rhythm with my breath. I wrote feverishly, trying to capture the fragmentary voices, the fragmented stories that danced just beyond comprehension. Outside, the wind rattled the broken window panes, carrying with it a cold that seeped into my bones. But inside I was warming to the mansion's dark heart, drawn deeper into its decay and despair. The wallpaper was no longer just decoration, it was a canvas of memory, a tapestry of pain and secrets that refused to fade. Hours passed unnoticed. My hands trembled as I peeled back another layer, revealing more of the sorrowful figure, her face clearer now, eyes glistening with unshed tears, lips trembling with a silent plea. She was trapped in this faded image, a ghost imprisoned in paper and paint, her story waiting to be told. I whispered to her, though I knew she could not answer. "Who are you?" I asked, voice barely audible. The room responded with a faint, sorrowful sigh, as if the house itself mourned alongside her. The mansion's decay mirrored the unspoken grief within me. I thought of the failures I carried, the relationships I'd let wither, the dreams I'd abandoned. Here, amidst the crumbling walls and whispered voices, I confronted not only Margaret Blackwood's sorrow but my own. This was no longer just a restoration project. It was a reckoning. As dawn crept through the grimy windows, I sat back on my heels, exhaustion and resolve warring within me. The wallpaper had given me a glimpse, a fragment of a past drenched in sorrow and secrets. Yet the story was far from complete. The whispers promised more, darker truths lurking beneath the surface. I closed my eyes, the image of the sorrowful woman etched deep within my mind. Somewhere in the mansion's shifting walls lay answers, and perhaps a chance for redemption, not just for the house but for me. But first, I had to listen. And the house would not let me forget. The next day dawned grey and heavy, the sky a blanket of muted slate that matched the mansion's somber mood. I returned to the faded wallpaper, notebook in hand, the sorrowful figure haunting my every thought. I could feel her watching me, a silent witness to my every move, her sadness a palpable presence in the stale air. I worked methodically, documenting each pattern, each whisper, each fragment of voices that surfaced as I stripped away the layers. The mansion seemed to breathe around me, alive with memories that clung to every cracked molding and splintered floorboard. Occasionally, I caught myself talking aloud, as if speaking to the house or to the sorrowful woman herself. "Tell me more," I whispered, tracing the faded contours of her face. "What happened here?" The whispers answered in fragments, snatches of names, places, accusations, and pleas. I wrote it all down, desperate to piece together a story that had long been buried beneath dust and decay. As the hours passed, I was overcome by a wave of exhaustion and emotion. The weight of the past pressed down on me, mingling with my own regrets and fears. For a moment, the room spun, the wallpaper's faded figure blurring before my eyes, her sorrow merging with my own. I steadied myself against the wall, breathing deeply, grounding myself in the present. The mansion was a mirror, a reflection of pain and loss, of secrets that refused to stay silent, and I was its chosen listener. The restoration was no longer just a job. It was a journey into the heart of darkness, where echoes of the past whispered through the wallpaper, and where I would have to confront not only the mansion's secrets, but the shadows within myself. The sorrowful woman's eyes followed me as I packed up my tools, a silent promise lingering in the air. The past was not done with me yet, and neither was the mansion. Evenings grew colder, and the mansion's whispers more persistent. As I lay awake in the sparse guest room, the sorrowful figure's image haunted my dreams, her eyes pleading, her story unfinished. I awoke with a start, the faint murmur of voices lingering in the darkness. I knew then that the mansion was not just a building of wood and stone, but a vessel of memory and pain. And I was entwined with it now, bound by the echoes of a past that refused to fade. The wallpaper was no longer just faded paper. It was a map, a guide to the truth hidden beneath years of silence and decay. And I would follow it wherever it led. The late afternoon sun slanted low across the withered lawn as I worked to clear the last of the peeling wallpaper in the east parlor. The faint murmurs that had become my unwelcome companions today seemed to hush, as if waiting for something or someone. I was halfway through removing a particularly stubborn strip when the sharp, deliberate knock at the front door startled me so much that I nearly dropped my scraper. I wasn't expecting visitors, not here, not now, and certainly not at this hour. Setting my tools aside, I wiped my hands on my dust-stained jeans and crossed the creaking floorboards toward the entrance. Before I could reach for the handle, the door swung inward, revealing a slender figure framed by the fading light. Mrs. Delaney stood there, her posture erect despite the years etched into the lines of her face. Her eyes, sharp and penetrating, held a keen intensity that unsettled me immediately. She wore a faded floral dress, the fabric thin and threadbare, yet she carried herself with an inexplicable dignity, like a guardian of secrets too old and heavy to share casually. "Miss Harper," she said, her voice a soft rasp, I thought it was time I paid you a visit." I hesitated, unsure whether to invite her in or gently close the door. But something in her gazed the way. It seemed to pierce right through the dust, and shadows made me step aside without a word. She entered without fuss, her footsteps light but deliberate on the warped wooden floor. The house seemed to hold its breath as she settled into one of the threadbare armchairs, her hands folded neatly in her lap. I sat opposite her, the air between us thick with unspoken tension. "You've stirred something," she began, eyes fixed on the peeling wallpaper I'd been stripping away moments before. "This house doesn't like to have its past disturbed." I nodded slowly, feeling a chill run down my spine. "I hear voices," I confessed, lowering my gaze. Whispers, faint but persistent. "I don't know if I'm imagining it or if the house is trying to tell me something." Mrs. Delaney's lips twitched into a sad smile. "They were not imagining it, Evelyn. The walls remember. They remember everything." I swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking in. "Do you know what happened here?" Her eyes darkened, and she leaned forward slightly. "More than you can fathom. But beware, some truths come with a price. The past is not so easily laid to rest, and the mansion will not let you go once it has you in its grasp." I felt a mixture of fear and determination swell within me. "I need to uncover the story," I said softly. "I need to understand." "Mrs. Delaney nodded, reaching into the pockets of her dress. She produced a small, folded piece of paper, yellowed and fragile. "This belonged to Margaret Blackwood," she said, pressing the letter into my palm. It's a fragment of her voice, a piece of the silence you were trying to break. "Handle it with care." The paper was brittle, the ink faded, but still legible. I traced the delicate script with trembling fingers, feeling the weight of decades pressing down on me. "Remember, Mrs. Delaney whispered, rising slowly, "not all who seek the truth survive what they find." Before I could respond, she was gone, swallowed by the shadows outside as the twilight deepened. The house seemed to exhale, its whispers swelling once more, a chorus of voices rising in a haunting symphony. I sat back, the letter clutched tightly, the room closing in around me. The wallpaper's patterns seemed to ripple and shift in the fading light, the sorrowful figure I had glimpsed days before flickering just beyond the edge of vision. That night, as I lay in the sparse guest room, sleep was elusive. Mrs. Delaney's words echoed in my mind, a warning and a challenge intertwined. The mansion was alive with secrets, and I had crossed the threshold. There was no turning back. Outside, the wind whispered through the broken window panes, carrying with it the weight of forgotten voices and the promise of revelations yet to come. The wallpaper would not stay still, and neither would I. The next morning, I returned to the parlor with renewed purpose. The letter lay open on the work table, its fragile script inviting me deeper into the labyrinth of shadows. With every strip of wallpaper peeled away, every whispered fragment caught and recorded, I felt the mansion's pulse quicken beneath my fingertips. Mrs. Delaney's visit was a turning point, an eerie beacon in the gathering darkness. The house was no longer just a project. It was a living enigma, drawing me into its decayed heart, and I would follow its whispers wherever they might lead. The air in the study was thick with dust and the faint scent of mildew, the once vibrant wallpaper now a faded tapestry of peeling edges and shadowed patterns. I knelt on the varnished wooden floor, the boards groaning softly beneath my weight. A scattered assortment of notes and sketches spread around me like the remnants of a desperate excavation. My fingers hovered over a particularly worn section of the wall, where the floral motifs had warped into something less natural, an arrangement of curling vines and petals that, at first glance, seemed innocuous but, upon closer inspection, revealed a cryptic symbol etched faintly into the underlayer of paper. The whispers had begun again, swirling like a restless wind around the room, indistinct voices murmuring just beyond comprehension. They were urgent, fragmented, as if struggling to break through the veil of time and decay that enveloped this house. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to focus despite the creeping unease that settled in my chest like a stone. Tracing the symbol with my fingertip, I caught a glimpse of the meticulous care with which it had been concealed. A cipher, perhaps an intentional message left behind by someone desperate to be heard. My heart pounded with a mix of excitement and dread. What had I stumbled upon? The room seemed to grow colder, a chill that seeped into my bones. A sudden draft whispered through the cracked window pane, ruffling the edges of my papers and carrying with it a faint, sorrowful wail. It was as if the mansion itself was mourning, its floral wallpaper twisting subtly before my eyes into shapes that resembled shadowy figures bowed in grief. I shivered involuntarily, the spectral melancholy pressing down on me like a weight. I hastily lit a lamp, its warm glow casting long, flickering shadows against the walls. Under its light, I began to piece together the fragments of code hidden within the wallpaper's layers. The symbols were not random. They formed patterns, sequences, phrases in a language that twisted around sorrow and betrayal. My handwriting became erratic as I transcribed the fragments, the whispers rising in pitch and intensity, swelling into anguished cries that reverberated through the empty house. The boundary between reality and the supernatural thinned until it seemed to dissolve entirely. I caught myself talking aloud to the house, questioning the voices, begging them to reveal their secrets. The wallpaper, with its shifting patterns and concealed messages, was no longer mere decoration. It was a living testament to the mansion's dark past, a palimpsest of hidden truths and silenced suffering. Suddenly, a loose strip of wallpaper fluttered sharply, disturbed by a gust that swept through the hallway. Beneath it lay a hidden sequence of symbols, more intricate and deliberate than any I had yet discovered. My breath caught in my throat. This was the key, the cipher that would unlock the deepest, most harrowing secrets of this place. As I pressed my palm against the wall, the whispers crescendoed into a cacophony of voices, a chorus of sorrow and rage that threatened to overwhelm me. My mind teetered on the edge, the mansion's spectral presence seeping into every thought, every shadow. But I could not turn back. The hidden messages demanded to be uncovered, their story told, no matter the cost. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for the descent into the heart of the mystery that the wallpaper held, one that would reveal the fate of Margaret Blackwood and perhaps unravel the fragile thread of my own sanity. The night deepened and the mansion whispered on. The afternoon sun waned behind thick clouds as I sat cross-legged on the floor of the drawing room, papers strewn around me like the shattered pieces of the mansion's past. Simon Clark was already there, seated at the heavy oak table, his glasses perched delicately on the bridge of his nose as he flipped through a brittle ledger. The air was thick with dust and the faint, ever-present scent of mildew and faded wallpaper glue. The walls around us, torn and ragged, revealed layers upon layers of peeling paper, each a whisper from a time long gone. "You're rereading too much into these patterns," Simon said, breaking the silence. His voice was calm but carried an unmistakable edge of skepticism. "There's no evidence that the wallpaper is anything more than decorative." "But it changes," I insisted, holding up a torn fragment that bore the faint outline of a woman's face. "Last night, I swear the pattern shifted. I heard whispers, Simon, not just imagination, real voices." Simon sighed, pushing his glasses up and leaning back in his chair. "Evelyn, I'm all for uncovering the truth, but we need to base it on facts, not ghosts." I felt a flicker of irritation mixed with a twinge of desperation. "You don't understand. This house is alive with its past. The wallpaper is a record, a confession. I can feel it." He shook his head, eyes narrowing. "Feeling isn't proof. Look here." He slid a yellowed newspaper clipping across the table. Margaret Blackwood's death was ruled an accident. No signs of foul play. I picked up the clipping, my fingers trembling slightly. The words stared back at me, cold and sterile. "Heiress dies in tragic fall at family estate." But I knew better. The whispers, the shifting walls, they told a different story. What if the investigation was flawed? I ventured. What if someone covered it up? Simon's expression softened, the frustration giving way to cautious curiosity. That's possible. Families do protect their own, but we need proof. I glanced back at the wall behind him. The wallpaper's faded floral motifs seemed to ripple subtly, the sorrowful face I'd glimpsed before barely visible beneath the peeling layers. I reached out to touch it, feeling the rough texture beneath my fingertips. "Look here," I said, pointing to a series of symbols I'd traced earlier, a pattern of interlocking vines and cryptic marks woven into the design. They were not random. They tell a story. Simon leaned in, adjusting his glasses again. It could be a signature or a maker's mark. Victorian wallpaper makers did sometimes include hidden symbols, but we need to cross-reference with historical records. Our conversation stretched into the evening, a push and pull between my intuition and his insistence on evidence. At times, frustration bubbled over, my obsession clashing with his pragmatism. Yet beneath the tension, a fragile respect was forming. Together, we began mapping the timeline of the mansion, piecing together the lives of its inhabitants and the secrets they carried. "There's more to this house than the paint and plaster," I murmured, eyes scanning the dim room. "I can feel it pressing in, like the walls themselves want to speak." Simon met my gaze, a flicker of unease crossing his features. "Just promise me we'll keep our feet on the ground. We need to find the truth, not get lost in shadows." I nodded, though part of me feared that the shadows were already swallowing me whole. As the night deepened, the whispers grew louder, threading through the silence like a cold wind. Somewhere between history and hauntings, fact and fear, the mansion's story waited to be uncovered, and I was determined to hear it, no matter the cost. Suddenly, a creak echoed from the floorboards behind us. We both froze, eyes darting toward the walls where the wallpaper's patterns seemed to flutter in the dim light. The house was alive, watching, waiting, and I was no longer sure where I ended it and its stories began. The hours slipped away unnoticed, and as dawn approached, the fragile alliance between Simon's reason and my obsession felt like the only hope to unravel the darkness that clung to the mansion's decaying bones. But with every secret uncovered, the house tightened its grip, and I wondered how long I could hold on before the walls closed in entirely. And so, with a quiet resolve, we plunged deeper into the mystery, knowing that the truth was buried beneath layers of wallpaper, lies, and time waiting for us to peel it back, one fragile piece at a time. I woke to the sound of faint murmurs curling through the stillness of the night, whispers that seemed to seep from the very walls themselves. The Victorian mansion, once merely a shell of peeling paint and rotting wood, had become something else entirely, an entity alive with voices, with memories that clawed their way through the faded wallpaper. But on this morning, the whispers were louder, more urgent, and the house felt as though it inhaled and exhaled with a breathing pulse. I staggered from my makeshift bed in the corner of the parlor, the cold floor chilling my bare feet as I moved toward the window. Outside, the fog clung low to the overgrown garden, but inside the air was thick with dust, decay, and something else harder to pin down. A flicker at the edge of my vision drew me to the wallpaper, the once delicate floral pattern now a grotesque dance of shifting shapes. The flowers seemed to ripple and writhe as if underwater, petals folding and unfolding in slow, sinister motion. I pressed my palm against the wall, and a shiver ran up my spine. The wallpaper's surface was slightly warm, almost pulsing beneath my touch. A soft, indistinct whisper brushed my ear. I spun around, heart pounding, eyes searching the empty room. Silence. "It's just your imagination," I muttered to myself, but the words felt hollow, more a plea than a reassurance. The days blurred together. Each morning, I returned to the mansion with a growing sense of dread undercut by a compulsive need to uncover the truth hidden beneath layers of dust and faded patterns. The whispers grew clearer, but so too did the visions. Walls shifted subtly, corners stretching or contracting when I wasn't looking. I began to see faces flicker behind the wallpaper, sorrowful eyes, a trembling hand reaching out, a flash of a pale woman in a worn Victorian dress. I started to question my own sanity. Was the house playing tricks on me, or had I allowed my obsession to tip me into madness? Simon Clark stopped by one afternoon. His glasses caught the dim light as he surveyed the room with a skeptical eye. "Evelyn," he said, voice steady but concerned, "you need to step back. This place is old and eerie, yes, but the mind can conjure shadows when under stress." His words, meant to ground me, only deepened my isolation. I nodded, but inside, the walls whispered louder, the wallpaper undulated with greater intensity, and the faces behind it grew more distinct, eyes pleading, accusing. One evening, as twilight blurred into night, I found myself standing in the narrow hallway near the grand staircase. The wallpaper rippled beneath my fingers like liquid silk, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and forgotten sorrow. A chill ran through me as the wallpaper peeled back in a slow, deliberate motion, revealing a hidden alcove filled with faded letters and brittle photographs. My breath caught. The past was no longer buried, but with revelation came torment. That night, the house seemed to close in. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, twisting and writhing as if alive. The whispers escalated into screams anguished, desperate, a cacophony that echoed inside my mind until I clutched my head, staggering against the cold plaster. I screamed into the void, the thin line between reality and nightmare dissolving. Was I haunted by the mansion or by my own demons? The following day, Mark Benson expressed his concern plainly. "Evelyn, you are not yourself. Maybe take a break, this house is getting to you." His practical tone was a balm and a rebuke. But how could I stop now? How could I abandon the voices that begged to be heard, the walls that demanded to be revealed? As night crept in once more, I could no longer tell where the house ended and I began. The wallpaper's whispers were no longer background noise. They were my tormentors and my companions. I was unraveling, pulled apart by decay, obsession, and the restless ghosts of the past. And yet, deep down, I knew I could not turn away. The mansion's story was woven into my own unraveling thread, and only by facing the darkness could I hope to find even a sliver of light. But the question that haunted me most was this: was I uncovering the mansion's secrets, or was the mansion consuming me whole? The shadows lengthened. The whispers grew louder, and I stood, trembling on the edge of madness, ready to step fully into the unknown. The walls breathed, the wallpaper shifted, and somewhere, deep in the marrow of the house, a secret waited to be claimed or to claim me first.